Hello, welcome to Two Peas in a Podcast. I'm Razultor, but you can call me Raz for short.
And I'm Sarah Fantastic.
And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about role-playing games, and specifically our favorite role-playing game, which is called D&D, which stands for Dungeons and Dragons, for those of you who didn't know. And what else are we doing, Sarah?
We are addressing the echoey mic situation from last week. Raz was messing with the options on our recording to try and make me not echo anymore, but in doing so made himself that very echoey without testing the mics. So we have hopefully remedied that situation for this week, and we have also ordered a new fancy mic that should be here by next episode that we can start recording with that instead.
Yep, so we should have very beautiful voices in the future that you guys can hear much more clearly. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was something that I posted on our Tumblr. So if you haven't checked out our Tumblr, which is a social media app that I'm not super familiar with, but I've enjoyed getting to know it more through our podcast, is my Snoke theory. So if you remember last episode, we talked about Star Wars, and so we didn't get to talk about Snoke too much, but I personally think that Snoke is around the same size as Yoda. And the whole reason they gave him this gigantic hologram is because he's compensating for his actual tiny size. Now I'm really upset because this is probably not how it's going to actually work out, but I'm really, really hoping that that's what it is.
Yeah, so make sure to check us out on Tumblr and look at our other social media sites as well.
Yeah, for sure. So we're going to go ahead and do our other introductory stuff. So if you remember from last week, we do one sort of random either story or obsession or something about our life for you guys to get to know us better. So Sarah, do you want to do that first?
Yeah, I'll go first. So today at work, I stole one of my coworkers' pens, and I told him that his pen wrote terribly, and he looked at me and said, "You're terrible." And without really thinking about it, I just went, "No, I'm Sarable." And my manager looked at me with the most deadpan, "I'm done" look I have ever seen. I actually ran away because I thought she was going to murder me. And that's the story of how I almost got fired for a really bad pun today.
If you don't know, Sarah is a huge fan of puns, and I am also a huge fan of puns, and that is going to be something that's part of our lives for forever, because puns are the best thing ever. Also, one of my favorite things about puns is I didn't realize it until I forget how recently it was. It was probably 2 years ago. But no pun intended is itself a pun on the word unintended, which was so great when I realized it.
Did you realize it, or did I tell you? Because I'm pretty sure I tell everybody that.
I think it was actually John Green who told me, because I'm like personal buddies with John Green, obviously. No, it was actually through one of John Green's YouTube videos on the Vlogbrothers channel.
Rude.
Yeah, so not you.
Rude.
Okay, so my story is a lot more boring than Sarah's, unfortunately. But yesterday was actually National Flannel Day.
Yes, National Flannel Day.
I didn't hear about this until Sarah told me about it today. But I actually bought 2 flannel shirts yesterday, apparently subconsciously celebrating National Flannel Day, because they were only $5 at Walmart, and I was like, hey, $5 for a shirt, that's pretty good, I'm just gonna get it, and if it doesn't work, hey, $5, it wasn't that bad.
We celebrated National Flannel Day, one of my favorite holidays.
Obviously. So, the other thing that we do is we talk about our fancy socks, which for you guys is Fridays, so we call this Fancy Sock Fridays, but for us it's Thursdays. So, what are your socks like this fancy Friday?
So my socks actually look like Thor. They've got the colors of his outfit, but my favorite thing about these socks, these ankle socks, is they have capes on the back of them.
Those are some pretty fancy socks. Also, I'm going to tease you here because you changed your socks just before we started recording for the podcast, so you wouldn't have boring socks for Fancy Sock Friday.
It was very cold this morning, so I chose warm socks over fancy socks and made the change before the podcast.
I guess that's understandable. So my socks are actually one of the most boring socks I own, but they're still kind of fancy-ish. They're red, gray, and navy argyle socks with a white pattern. That's the dot pattern for the argyle.
I have a friend who insists that Argyle is the most pretentious of patterns. So we'll see how that works out today.
See, Argyle is like the most plain that my socks get. So I would say for me they're the most boring pattern, but for other people they're very pretentious and posh, as the Brits would say.
Posh.
So we wanted to talk about two major things when we're talking about RPGs, or role-playing games as they're called sometimes. RPGs is so much easier to say though, so we're probably going to say it that way, or we're just going to say D&D because it's even easier to say, and that's the type of RPG that we like to play the most. What?
I pushed my glasses up and made a weird sound on
Oh,
my headphones.
well, hopefully we're still recording your voice, because otherwise it's going to be really upsetting. So, anyways, the first thing that we wanted to talk about when it comes to D&D are some of the characters that we play. And I have had four role-playing game characters. One of them I had for multiple role-playing games because I called him the transcendent role-playing character. And then we're also going to talk about some of our favorite stories, just from things that we did in battle or things that we did when interacting with NPCs. And so the first character that I want to talk about, which is one of my characters, of course, is what I'm actually named after in the podcast. His name is Razultor, as you can guess, and he did go by Raz for short. He actually is the one that I call the transcendent character because I have a friend who I used to play with before Sarah joined our D&D group, and we used to test out some different RPGs because he's actually a game reviewer and does those online. And so for all of the different RPGs that we played, my name was always Razultor, no matter what I was and no matter who I did. But as I like to call him, original Razultor, the OG Razultor, was temple schooled. So he grew up in a temple to Ogma, who is the goddess of knowledge. And he was super duper awkward because of that. And so he had terrible charisma and was really bad at talking to people. And sometimes when I talked, just like snot and spit would come out of my mouth because I would roll really poorly.
That sounds like a normal day in my life, actually.
Yep, and so I was an elf wizard. I was very good at magic, very bad at people skills. So Sarah, what was one of your characters?
So probably my favorite character that I've ever played, her name was Art. She is a tiefling or a tiefling, depending on who you're talking to and what accent they're speaking in. She was a ranger, but she was 100% convinced that she was actually a bard. And so she would oftentimes just break into random song or do singing checks instead of engaging in battle, and was very bad at it, and our dungeon master punished her whenever she did poorly.
I was the dungeon master for that campaign, so I guess I can take part of the blame for that. So what were some of the other things with art? Did you want to talk about those now?
No, we can talk about those later in later segments.
Oh, that's right. We have other favorite story things. My current character that I'm playing, we're playing the Out of the Abyss campaign, which is the most recent 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons campaign that they put out. It's a super creepy campaign where you're in the Underdark, and you have to deal with crazy things like madness and other stuff. So I'm playing a catfolk race, which is a homebrew race. It's not actually in any of the handbooks. And so I found it through the D&D wiki, which is a really great site that you can find some really good characters and different things if you want to do even more customizable things. And so I'm a catfolk and I'm a paladin, and he is dedicated to Kelimvor, who is the god of death. And so unlike most paladins who are that lawful good, protect people, do good, I'm lawful neutral. And so I'm following laws, but I'm also very much about bringing those people who deserve death, bringing them the death that they deserve so they can be judged by Kelimvor.
And in the same campaign, I am playing a drow named Zan. Zan has a funny story behind her name, but first, I would like to point out that when Raz made the outline for this week, instead of giving her a nice character description like everyone else, he just put the racist, sexist drow rogue. To be fair, Zan is fairly rude and hateful. She does not get along with people, although she does have very good charisma, unlike OG Razultor. But Zan's name actually came about because in another RPG that we were playing at the same time, Raz has a character named Xander spelled with a Z. And I wanted my character to be named Xander spelled with an X. but Raz would not allow it. So instead, I made my Out of the Abyss character's name Zan just to spite him.
So I'm glad you enjoy coming up with character names and not just doing them out of spite for certain people.
You know, just normal, everyday gamer rage.
So those are some of the characters that we play. Characters are really fun for me. They're probably the most fun part of D&D, especially if you're not DMing, you're going to be playing a character. And so you really get to discover things about their background, and there are certain like choices and actions that the character would make that you wouldn't necessarily make as a person. And so I think blurring those lines and seeing the differences between those lines are one of the most interesting parts of doing like something like D&D.
I agree.
So now we're going to move on to some of our favorite stories. So I think, oh, the first one is actually one of my stories from when I played OG Raz, as we're calling him this episode. So OG Raz had a problem, and that was that OG Raz often rolled very poorly when it came to doing attacks in battle. And so there was a certain time, I think it was the only time that you played with us during that campaign, where we were in this town, and this town was being attacked by a bunch of crazy dragon cultists, and there was a gigantic blue dragon that was flying around, shooting lightning breath at people, and we were so afraid of that dragon that I sent some scorching rays at it. I definitely missed one. I hit a townsperson in the back of the head with the other, and then I think I want to say I hit him a second time as well.
Did with
Then
the same.
I pulled out a wand, and this wand had a thing where it multiplied damage every turn. So the first turn it did 1 damage, the second turn 2, the third turn it did 4 damage, and it kept going on and on and on until the person dies. And so I hit him with the wand, the same townsperson, and our DM interpreted it as they saw that I was such a crazy person that all the townspeople started to attack me and wanted to murder me, and they had to like yell at the townspeople and calm them down before they basically rioted and took Raz out and executed him. So I'm glad that we were able to talk them out of killing my character, but that was one of my, I think, really fun stories.
I think we saw a little bit of the blurring of the lines there where you started calling OG Raz me, which is a mistake that I make all the time. I wouldn't necessarily call it a mistake, but definitely do have to work to keep those things separated because the characters become so dear to you. My story that I'm going to tell right now is actually the day that we refer back to as Moose Naming Day. Now, my character Art was a ranger, and when she reached 3rd level, I believe it was, she took on the special skill of Beastmaster, which meant she got an animal companion. And so I wanted to find a young baby moose and raise a baby moose. And I couldn't decide on a name right away. Names are something that's very difficult for me, which is why I name my characters after other characters, apparently. And so I told the DM for that game that on the 8th day after getting my moose, I would name the moose with a traditional song and ceremony. And luckily we ended that round on the end of the 7th day. So I had time to leave and actually compose a song. And when we met back to play the next week, I even had some lute music that did not go with the song at all because that's just Art's style. And I sang terribly and was awarded some inspiration for singing badly and for naming my moose.
So basically what inspiration means is you can choose to take advantage on any sort of roll, which basically means instead of rolling 1d20, you get to roll 2 and you take the higher roll. So basically it's a really good thing to happen. And so I think it was hilarious. As I think we said, I was the DM for that campaign. You can call me the DM. It's okay. I was there.
I'm trying to stay out of character. I'm trying to be fair.
You're trying not to conflate D&D and real life, in other words.
It's very hard.
It is very hard. So another story that we wanted to tell was one where I was DMing, and I wanted to set up a really climactic final battle to happen. It was our last session. We were about to complete the campaign, which is the 5th edition Prince of the Apocalypse, or I think it's Princes of the Apocalypse. So that campaign, which is the one that came out right before Out of the Abyss, we were finishing up that campaign, and it was coming to a close, and we were going to say goodbye to all these characters. And so I went into that last battle to be this big epic fight. And so we ended up having like a red dragon. We fought one of the princes of fire, who was this crazy fire lord who could do incredible damage. And so I also knew that I didn't want the characters to die. I wanted them to live through this experience. And so because of that, we had met a lich, which is basically a super powerful undead who can raise undead armies for himself. And Art had actually befriended him and sung him a song that made him remember who he was, so he didn't want to kill them. And so his name is Renwick, and he is very dramatic and he's very performative, so he wants to perform for everyone whatever he does. And so they decided to summon Renwick. They had a scroll of summoning, I believe. And so they could call upon either, it was Thava, this character who was a paladin, and she could either call on Bahamut, who is the dragon god, who was her god, or she could call call on Renwick. And so she said, Renwick is more reliable than Bahamut. And we almost said that Bahamut had to strike her down for her blasphemy. But we understood that interpreted well, it just meant that Renwick would be there. If Bahamut sent like some small dragon, it wouldn't quite work. And so Renwick comes shooting out of this gigantic like fire titan and comes out of the top and says, I forget what he even said. I think he said something like presentation as he like entered. And so that's just a little bit about Renwick's character, but it was definitely a really great final fight, and I think that the players really enjoyed it.
It was very entertaining. I'm actually going to switch these stories, so don't freak out. I know I'm going off script, but I wanted to talk about this one first. My character, Art, she was a ranger, so she used a longbow, and Art was never good at anything except rolling really well when she sang. She could roll really well to sing, but everything else she was bad at. And so the first time I rolled a natural 1 when shooting my arrow, we decided that it was such a bad roll that I actually grabbed an advertisement arrow that Art carried around, and it landed in a tree, and a scroll unfurled, and I was put on the spot and asked what was on the scroll. And so I decided it was a picture of Art with her lute, and it said chipmunk christenings. And so from then on, anytime anything went bad, a scroll would unroll, and it would just be advertising Art baptizing little forest animals against their will.
It was super great. So my current character, for my next story, has this armor that he got, and so he actually found, I think it was either a temple to Kelemvor, or it was some sort of temple that was said to hold this sacred armor. And so it was a very interesting thing where there was this person who had been avoiding death and had been trying to avoid their judgment from Kelemvor. And so we went in and we had to end up fighting this person. And so I got the armor and I was like, oh, this armor is beautiful. And it has a certain like glowiness to it, which is strange. And the person who I killed and sent to Kelemvor struck me with some sort of red bolt right before they died. And so I don't know what happened. But the next session, when we got into a fight, all of a sudden my DM said, roll percentile dice for me, which are basically dice that will give you a result between 1 and 100. And so I rolled the dice. I think I rolled pretty low. All of a sudden, my armor disappears except for the glowy part. And my AC goes from 18 to 13, which is very bad. It means that you have a much bigger likelihood of getting hit. And so I was like, what the crap? So I have armor that protects both from physical attacks and from incorporeal attacks. But if I roll poorly on percentile die, either the solid part will disappear and it'll just be incorporeal, or the solid part will stay and the incorporeal part will go away if I roll too high. So it's been a very interesting thing, but I think it's been a really fun magic item for me that I've enjoyed.
Also, if you roll badly enough, it can disappear completely, is what we have been told.
That is true. I am very afraid of that result.
So this is where I'm actually switching out a story, because you were telling a story about Raksha, and I wanted to tell a story about Zan. Zan pretends like she doesn't like everybody, and she probably actually doesn't like anyone, but she likes feeling courageous and bold. And so the first time we got in an actual battle, I just hit my microphone, I'm sorry. The first time we got in an actual battle, we were trying to escape from drow who were keeping us prisoners, and we had to go down in this little tiny basket that only held 4 of us, and I think there were like 14 of us. And Rockshaw actually had some children he was taking care of, and one of them actually fell out of the basket off the ledge onto a spider web. And the spiders were coming, the spider web was on fire, we were being shot at. It was terrible, and so Zan, being obnoxious and hateful but brave, decided she was going to jump onto the spider web, grab the child, rip him out of the spider web, and then instead of jumping into the basket, that if she had, that would have overweighed the basket and they all would have fallen to their deaths. She waited till the basket got to the ground, then jumped onto the chain and crawled down, which is an extremely difficult feat to manage. I think I had to make 6 or 7 rolls to make sure that I didn't fall and die. But I made it to the ground. Well, Zan made it to the ground perfectly fine, and she thought that would win her some brownie points with this catfolk person, but he just hates her still. It's okay.
I'm pretty sure that I was upset with you for something, and then you said something racist, and then you just say, "Here is your child." Because the webs had gotten stuck to your hands, the child was stuck to you.
Yes, I was just holding this child out, like, take this thing. It was impressive, but also Zan just likes to insult people.
We also want to tell the Jin story real fast?
Yeah, go ahead, you can tell it.
Okay, so Art was actually, we were in a dungeon in the campaign that I was DMing, and I also played a character in it. And we had a fun character who was a monk named Cusco, and he was with us. So Art wanted to perform for this certain djinn that we met. The djinn was at least, I want to say, 4 to 5 levels above where our challenge rating said we should be. And so the goal for that encounter, like if you read it in the DM handbook, is to make sure your players don't fight it. And it's basically like, if they fight it, there's a very good chance that they die, and it's not going to work. So she decides to sing to this djinn. We all know that Art is very bad at singing. Sara, who plays Art, rolled a natural 20.
Which, if you play D&D, basically a natural 20 means you can do anything within reason. And I thought that meant that I could sing to the djinn and turn the djinn to be on our side to help us.
But what I interpreted as the Lord and Master, the Dungeon Master, I interpreted as Cusco and Rico, which is who I was playing at the time. They looked at each other, they nodded, they grabbed Art by both of her arms and pulled her out of the room because they saw that she was reaching for her loot, and we all left and made it out fine.
The djinn was just so surprised that I pulled out a loot to attack it with, seeing that I was a ranger. Cusco is actually one of my favorite characters to interact with. He had a great accent. It was super fun to play with Cusco. I really miss how Art and Cusco interacted because they were goofy and kind of inappropriate together, and I think all of that just went over Art's head, but she had a really good time interacting with Cusco.
I think it's great. So the other thing we wanted to talk about was, I'm just going to go ahead and go to our advice section about playing D&D, and then we can probably close out this episode. So for me, I wanted to give a little bit of D-ice. It almost sounds like dice, which is almost a good D&D pun.
So you want to give dice advice?
Really nice dice advice. That's what we should call this if we do another D&D segment.
I agree.
So for our really nice dice advice section, I wanted to first give you some advice if you're DMing. And so something that Matt Mercer, who is a guy who does a big role-playing thing that's on Twitch, actually, that gets streamed live and does really well. It's Critical Role. He actually does this thing where he has his players describe the way that they kill things in really big battles. And so it is a really good way to keep player involvement and keep it from where it's like person's turn to person's turn to person's turn, and people can really zone out really easily during that combat. So instead, if people are describing how they kill something, they kind of have to pay attention to what went on before it so they can describe it really well. And so I think that for me, having them describe their own kills was something that I started learning to do, and I think that you guys really enjoyed it, and it really helped keep players involved.
For actually playing a character, because I have never been a dungeon master, I've only played characters. My advice is, if you're struggling to really connect with your character and to stay in character while playing, is to create one very detailed, important memory from that character's past. And then anytime you're struggling with getting into character or thinking about how your character would respond, is to think about that event and how it would affect this character's decisions right now. That's what I have to do with Zan a lot. I really struggle to connect with her because, as Raz has said before, she is very sexist, very racist, very hateful, and sometimes I struggle with making her be too playful or too funny, or even being too compassionate sometimes. And so I just have to think back to a key memory I have of her childhood with an interaction with her older brother that did not go well, that sort of helped shape her into the character she was today.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, and that's definitely something I've tried to do with my characters as well. Having that kind of key moment that defined who they are right now in the past that they look back on. So that's it for all that we have to talk about our Dungeons and Dragons experiences and characters, and then our short, nice dice advice section.
You might want to put some ice on that burn.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yeah.
So anyways, don't forget to follow us on our socials. We have a Facebook page. You can always follow us and like us on SoundCloud. We may try and follow you back. You can do our Facebook page like I mentioned. We also have Twitter, and we have Tumblr, and we have Pinterest, and they're all linked on our SoundCloud. Usually they're either 2Ps in a podcast or Raz and Sara, and so you can find us under one of those two things. The other thing that we wanted to talk about was, I think that we're still calling you either the Peas Corps, which I think is good, but Sara also came up with a really good one.
I want to call you all the people, like Peaple. It's misspelling people. It's a pun.
Are they individual people, and then when they're together, they're peoples?
Yes.
So it's going to be an interesting play on plural and singular as well.
Mostly it was just me being obnoxious and over-explaining puns.
If any of you guys have better P puns that you think that we should call our fans by, that's a really bad way to say it, feel free to comment on our Facebook when we share this video, or on any of our other social medias that I'm sure that we will share it on. And peas out.